Picture this. A band so powerful, so cerebral, so genuinely unlike anything else in American rock. They sold millions of records, packed arenas across 2 continents, and wrote one of the most iconic guitar riffs in rock history. Their music appeared in Hollywood films, celebrated by Saturday Night Live, covered, sampled, and worshipped for decades. Critics called them the thinking man's heavy metal band. And then, one by one, the people who built this thing walked away, or were pushed out. The classic lineup fractured. The label dropped them. Legal disputes erupted over the very name they'd bled for. By the late 1980s, the band that once stood shoulder to shoulder with Aerosmith and KISS on arena stages was barely recognizable. This is the story of how brotherhood, mythology, and one of rock's most underrated catalogs were destroyed, not by outsiders, but by the slow, grinding rot from within. To understand the collapse, we have to go back to Stony Brook, New York. 1967. Long Island, New York. Not exactly the birthplace you'd expect for one of America's most mysterious, occult-tinged rock bands. But there it was, a group of musicians orbiting Stony Brook University, hungry, weird, and completely uninterested in playing by anyone else's rules. They started as Soft White Underbelly, then Stock Forest Group. Names that told you everything. This wasn't going to be a conventional band. And at the center of their world? A man named Sandy Pearlman. Pearlman was their manager, their mythologist, their conceptual architect. He didn't just manage the band, he constructed them. He fed them imagery rooted in occult symbolism, science fiction, and literary darkness. He wanted a band that felt like a secret society. And that's exactly what they became. The lineup that would define them crystallized around 5 distinct personalities. Eric Bloom, the commanding frontman. Buck Dharma Roser, the quietly brilliant guitarist. Alan Lanier, the atmospheric glue on keys and rhythm guitar. And the Bouchard brothers, Joe and Albert, the engine room holding everything together. They signed to Columbia Records in 1971 and released their debut in 1972. Hard rock with brains. Psychedelia with teeth. Their logo, a hook and cross symbol that resembled the alchemical sign for lead, and that deliberately stylistic umlaut in oyster, told audiences, we are something different. They toured relentlessly, building a cult following city by city. Critics praised their musicianship. Underground fans treated them like a secret worth protecting. But even here, in these early days of promise, something dangerous was already embedded in the foundation. Sandy Pearlman's influence was total. His vision was powerful, but powerful visions have a cost. When one person holds that much creative and managerial authority over a band, it creates an imbalance, a dependency, a pressure system that, given enough time, always finds a crack to split through. The seeds of destruction were already planted. They just hadn't sprouted yet. 1974. Secret Treaties drops, and the critical world pays serious attention. This was a band firing on every cylinder, conceptually rich, sonically ferocious, musically sophisticated in ways most hard rock acts simply weren't. The album announced something real. Blue Öyster Cult wasn't a fluke. They were building toward something massive. Then came 1976, and Agents of Fortune changed everything. The album went platinum. It became their commercial breakthrough. And buried within it was a track that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Don't Fear, the Reaper. Written by Dharma. It opens with one of rock's most recognizable guitar riffs, clean, hypnotic, meditative. Lyrically, it explores eternal love and the acceptance of death with a poetic restraint that most rock bands in 1976 couldn't dream of touching. The song cracked the top 20 on the Billboard Hot 100. It became an FM radio staple. It was everywhere. But beneath this triumph, something was quietly shifting. They pressed forward. Spectres arrived in 1977, delivering the fan favorite, Godzilla. Proof the band could be both thunderously heavy and playful. Then came their collaboration with Patti Smith, who co-wrote Career of Evil, signaling that Blue Öyster Cult was operating on a cultural level most rock bands never reach. By the late 1970s, they were a global force. Arena headliners, Europe tours, standing alongside Aerosmith and KISS as one of America's biggest rock acts. 1981 brought another commercial peak. Burnin' For You cracked the top 40 and became one of their most enduring radio tracks. What fans didn't see was that the internal temperature was rising fast. 5 strong personalities. Years on the road. A powerful outside force shaping their identity. A manager whose vision had gotten them here, but whose dominance had quietly bred resentment. The question was never if something would break. It was only when. The slow burn dread was building. And the audience, those packed arenas, had no idea. Let's stop here and appreciate what Blue Öyster Cult had actually built by the early 1980s. Platinum records. A live reputation placing them in the conversation with the biggest acts on earth. A catalog that would stand the test of time. And, Don't Fear, the Reaper, not just a hit, but a cultural artifact. Being used in films. Referenced on television. That guitar riff becoming the kind of thing that gets played at the apocalypse in every Hollywood screenplay. This was the mountaintop. And as they stood on it, looking out over everything they'd earned, everything off stage was cracking. Because the same year that should have cemented their legacy, 1981, was also the year the unraveling began. The moment that looked like triumph was, in fact, a trampoline straight into collapse. The first crack was enormous. Albert Bouchard was gone. Albert Bouchard's departure in 1981 wasn't a lineup change. It was a structural earthquake. Albert wasn't just the drummer. He was one of the foundational creative voices, someone whose DNA was woven into the band's sound and mythology. Losing him fractured the chemistry that had taken over a decade to build. The classic 5-piece, the lineup that had made the records, done the tours, built the legend, was broken. And once it started, it didn't stop. The band began chasing more radio-friendly sounds in the mid-1980s. Adapt or die, it made commercial sense. But longtime fans heard abandonment. The intellectual darkness, the cryptic edge, that sense of Blue Öyster Cult existing slightly outside the normal rules of rock. It was evaporating. Lanier departed temporarily. Joe Bouchard left in 1986. Columbia Records, the label that had championed them since 1971, dropped the band in the late 1980s. The band briefly disbanded in 1986. Let That Land. A band that had sold millions of records, that had packed arenas on 2 continents. Gone. They reunited in 1987, but the reunion came wrapped in legal disputes over the band name, management chaos, and a rotating door of members that made it nearly impossible to track who was even in the band anymore. Then came Imaginos in 1988. The album had a production history that reads like a slow-motion disaster. Largely driven by Albert Bouchard's vision, a concept record years in the making, it was released under the Blue Öyster Cult name despite fierce internal disputes over ownership and direction. The fractured process was audible in the final product. It felt like a record made by people who were no longer in the same room, or the same decade. The trust was gone. The chemistry was gone. The commercial momentum that had once made them one of America's biggest rock acts was a distant memory. And the lowest point wasn't one dramatic explosion, a staged walk-off, a televised meltdown. It was slower and in some ways worse than that. It was the gradual erosion of everything. Member by member. Album by album. Show by show. Blue Öyster Cult had fallen. So where did they go from here? The 1990s saw the band do something not every fallen act manages. They survived. Not triumphantly. Not with platinum records. But Buck Dharma and Eric Bloom, the 2 survivors, held the name together, kept a version of the band on the road, and became staples of classic rock festivals where audiences who'd loved them in the 70s could reconnect with something that still mattered. Albert Bouchard pursued solo projects. Joe Bouchard stepped away. The Brotherhood, the 5-piece that had once made something genuinely special, was now operating in separate universes. The band released Heaven Forbid in 1998 and Curse of the Hidden Mirror in 2001, records that showed there was still creative life in what remained. Fans breathed a cautious sigh of relief. Maybe the worst was behind them. But the story wasn't over. Here's what nobody tells you about legacy. It doesn't settle. It fights. The legal disputes over the band name that began in the 1980s cast a shadow that never fully lifted. When you've built something iconic, a logo recognized worldwide, a catalog anchored by one of rock's immortal songs, the question of ownership isn't just legal. It's existential. Who gets to be Blue Öyster Cult? Is it the 2 surviving members touring under the name? The classic lineup who made the records that matter? Or a concept that ultimately belonged to Sandy Pearlman's original vision? Meanwhile, don't fear. The Reaper took on a life that complicated everything. In 2000, an SNL sketch, with an absurd demand for more cowbell during the song's recording, turned one of rock's most atmospheric tracks into a comedy meme. Overnight, millions who'd never owned a BC record knew the song. But they knew it as a punchline. For a band that had built their entire identity on being intellectual, the thinking person's metal act, what did it mean that your signature song was now famous for a joke? Nobody stole the song. No lawsuit was filed. But the cultural framing had shifted in a way the band had zero control over. A strange kind of legacy theft with no clear villain. The former members who had given years of their lives to building this thing watched from a distance as the name continued touring, new lineups performing their songs, their catalog becoming somebody else's operating identity. The wounds from the 1980s never healed. The rift between those who left and those who stayed, between the classic vision and the ongoing machine, remained raw and unresolved. Decades later, the battle had become entirely about legacy, about who gets credit, about what gets remembered, and whether the thing that was truly Blue Öyster Cult, that mythology-soaked, Pullman-shaped five-piece of the 1970s, was permanently, irreversibly gone. So where does Blue Öyster Cult stand today? In 2020, nearly 2 decades after their last studio album, they released The Symbol Remains. New music, new material, proof that even after everything, something was still burning. Fans showed up. Critics noted it. It wasn't secret treaties. It wasn't agents of fortune. But it existed, and after everything this band had been through, that meant something real. Dharma and Bloom continue to tour. The catalog streams consistently. A new generation discovers, don't fear, the Reaper through playlists and film scores, experiencing that iconic riff for the first time, completely unaware of the warfare that surrounded it. But the classic lineup? Gone. The 5 musicians who came together in Stony Brook in the late 1960s, who built something singular under Pullman's mythological hand, will almost certainly never share a stage again. And that's the tragedy at the center of this story. Blue Öyster Cult didn't fail because they lacked talent. They didn't fail because they made bad music. They fractured because success, over enough time, under enough pressure, exposes every crack in the foundation. The imbalance of influence, the competing visions, the toll of decades on the road. 5 people who started as collaborators and ended as strangers. What makes it sting most is the catalog they left behind. Secret treaties, agents of fortune, specters, records that hold up, records that reward deep listening, records that prove this band, at their peak, was operating on a level most contemporaries never touched. Buck Dharma is consistently cited among rock's most underrated guitarists. And honestly, that word, underrated, tells the whole story. The world never quite gave them what they deserved. They rose. They fractured. They endured. A band that survived almost everything except each other. So I want to hear from you. What part of this story hits hardest? The classic lineup falling apart? The name disputes? The way, don't fear, the Reaper became a punchline instead of the dark masterpiece it actually is? If you saw Blue Öyster Cult live, any era, drop it in the comments right now. Like, subscribe, and stay close. Because rock's greatest rise and fall stories? We're just getting started. See you in the next one.